Hey everybody, it's Elizabeth with World's Cup of Joe, Awaken Your Soul. We are coming back for the second part of our SoulLove through literature series, where we explore if Jane Eyre really is a novel about a twin flame connection. So without further ado, let's get to it. Recap of part one. In part one of our first SoulLove through literature series, we started discussing if the epic novel, Jane Eyre, by Charlotte Bronte, was a story of a twin flame union, and opened with the initial meeting of Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester. I asserted my opinion that if indeed these two shared one soul, it would be Jane that was the negative polarity and Mr. Rochester the positive. The clues aren't fully revealed until later in the book, but I wanted to make you all aware of my own hypothesis on the polarities for you to understand the evidence that I will attempt to lay out for you. In part two of this series, we will watch as Jane and Mr. Rochester get better acquainted with one another the day after their initial meeting. Jane works for Mr. Rochester in the capacity of a governess for his daughter Adele, and it is in this role she serves that she believes she's expected to have more contact with him, not realizing it is him requesting her presence. We will continue to look for signs and clues that these two are in a twin flame connection and attributes of each polarity. Part 2, Getting More Acquainted. Quote 1. I discerned in the course of the morning that Thornfield Hall was a changed place. It had a master. For my part, I liked it better. Jane Eyre. The first morning after Mr. Rochester's return, Jane could already feel a different energy in the home. She commented on all the changes she felt take place in the house. Then she commented, it had a master. For my part, I liked it better. Like I mentioned in part one, Jane tried to convey that she was indifferent when meeting Mr. Rochester, but she was drawn to him in a way that she didn't indulge to explain. Quote 2. Mr. Rochester would be glad if you and your pupil would take tea with him in the drawing room this evening, said she. He has been so much engaged all day that he could not ask to see you before. Mrs. Fairfax. It is not until later in the book that it is revealed that Mr. Rochester is not very fond of Adele, Jane's charge. He has raised her like a daughter, but she is actually the product of a past fiancé who cheated on him with another man. He ended up getting guardianship over her, but always held a sense of resentment towards this young girl, despite spoiling her with material things. So with knowing that context, you will understand that Mr. Rochester inviting Adele and Jane up for tea the second day he was home was explicitly for him to get better acquainted with Jane. Jane had presumed at this time it was because he wanted to spend quality time with Adele, and because she was the governess, would join them for tea as a mere employee. Mrs. Fairfax's comment of, he has been so much engaged all day that he could not ask to see you before, indicates that Mr. Rochester would have wanted to see her sooner. He had been thinking of her, and the first thing he chose to do once free was spend it in the company of Jane. I believe this shows that addictive energy had been activated already by this time within him. Quote 3. You had better change your frock now, Mrs. Fairfax. Is it necessary to change my frock? Jane Eyre. Yes, you had better. I always dress for the evening when Mr. Rochester is here, Mrs. Fairfax. This is a very telling exchange between Jane and Mrs. Fairfax. Here, Jane has just been invited to tea by the lord of the house, and she is indifferent about her appearance and the clothes she wears. This is a clue as to her being the negative polarity. Here, he is wanting to see her the first chance he gets on that second day, while she doesn't even consider dressing up for him. Jane actually seems taken aback that she would have to dress up to go and see him for tea. It doesn't even cross her mind that she should not go in her regular apparel. unused as I was to stranger, it was rather a trial to appear thus formally summoned in Mr. Rochester's presence. Jane Eyre. This quote is just further proof that Jane has no need to impress Mr. Rochester. She thinks the task of meeting him feels like work because of the effort she must take to ready herself to be in front of him. She expresses this like it is a burden rather than something she's excited to do. Now keep in mind, if you're the positive polarity, you're going to think nothing but being excited and wanting to show off for your person. But Jane doesn't do that. The first exchange between the two characters is actually somewhat awkward. In it, little Adele has asked her father if he brought a gift home for Jane on his travels, since he is always bringing her gifts when he is away. This request of Adele's puts Jane on the spot with Mr. Rochester, asking her if she expected a present from him. "Did you expect a present, Miss Eyre? Are you fond of presents?" And he searched my face with eyes that I saw were dark, irate, and piercing. I like overanalyzing this quote. When he asked her if she was fond of presents, it was like he was trying to determine what impressed her. As a positive polarity, I know I always wanted to know what would make my person happy. In the beginning of our connection, anything he would mention that he liked, I would start researching and try to buy it for him. I thought that my behavior was just indicative of how much I cared for him, but now I realize that the addictive energy was rampant, and I was trying to treat this 5D connection as one would in the 3D by impressing my person with things. It seems like Mr. Rochester wants to know what 3D items will woo Jane and pique her interest in him. The next part of the quote, that he searched her face with dark, irate, and piercing eyes, just shows the intensity that he was looking at her with. She mistook the tone of his eyes as irate, but I think he was just so intently focused on her because of his addictive energy that she misjudged passion for irate. Quote 6. Before I say the quote, I included this next passage because it needed to be read together to understand what was going on. And before I read it, let me explain so it doesn't just sound like nonsense. Mr. Rochester is jokingly insinuating in this conversation that Jane is descended from fairies or elves. When he comments about the little green men, that is who he is referring to. For a bit of historical context, back in the 19th century, there was actually a resurgence in the belief that fairies and other folklore existed and were not merely stories. Intellectuals, scientists, historians, even theologians believed in the existence of elves and fairies, and there was a quest to prove their existence. The interaction that is exchanged between the two of them is quite unique when discussing this. They understand each other in such a way, even only on the second day they've met, more than someone who has known Mr. Rochester for years, Mrs. Fairfax. "No wonder you have rather the look of another world. I marveled where you had got that sort of face. When you came on me in Hay Lane last night, I thought unaccountably of fairy tales and had half a mind to demand whether you had bewitched my horse. I'm not sure yet. Who are your parents?" Mr. Rochester. "I have none." Jane. "I thought not. And so you were waiting for your people when you sat on that stile." Mr. Rochester. "For whom, sir?" Jane. "For the men in green. It was a proper moonlight evening for them." Mr. Rochester. "The men in green all forsook England 100 years ago," said I, speaking as seriously as he had done, "and not even in Hay Lane or the field about Eyre could you find a trace of them." Jane. Mrs. Fairfax had dropped her knitting and, with raised eyebrows, seemed wondering what sort of talk this was. In this passage, this topic is discussed covertly between Rochester and Jane when he suggests that she is related to elves. Jane immediately understands his reference, despite the others in the room not being in on the conversation. She responds with all seriousness that those men had left England. They keep talking between them on a subject that completely baffles Mrs. Fairfax. Notice her reaction. She had dropped her knitting while raising her eyebrows at them, wondering what kind of talk this was. What I want to convey to you about this conversation is that Jane and Mr. Rochester are so in tune with one another that they can play upon a topic between themselves that is lost to the others in the room. When one meets their twin flame, it feels like you have met someone you have known forever, like you have met yourself, in a sense, and you essentially have because you share the same soul. I love this passage because it demonstrates how well these two know each other despite not knowing each other. They can already communicate in a way that others in the room feel left out. That is a powerful connection. Quote 7. Brocklehurst, who I understand directs Lowood, is a parson, is he not? And you girls probably worshipped him, as a convent full of religiouses would worship their director. Mr. Rochester. Oh, no, Jane. You are very cool? No? What? A novice not worship her priest? That sounds blasphemous, Mr. Rochester. It's not even the end of the first evening together, and Mr. Rochester is already showing signs of jealousy. Didn't anyone tell him that's push energy? Let me explain this exchange. Mr. Rochester is questioning Jane about her time at a boarding school she attended while growing up. She went because she was essentially an orphan being raised by an aunt that didn't want her or care for her. She went to this school in which treatment of the students was extremely severe under the direction of the priest, Mr. Brocklehurst, that Mr. Rochester had referenced. But he doesn't ask her about her time at the school, but rather he is inquiring to if she had feelings for Mr. Brocklehurst. He didn't stop there once she told him she didn't like the man. He continues to question the sincerity of her answer, making it sound incredulous that a schoolgirl wouldn't have an obsession for the person in such a position of authority. This conversation reminded me of any time I would question my person on the relationships he had had before me. I was purposefully asking questions because there was a part of me that wanted him to tell me that I was the only one he ever loved. I was fishing for him to tell me that no one compared to me in his past, nor could anyone ever measure up to me in the future. It was all push energy. That is the same energy that Mr. Rochester is putting out with Jane when questioning her feelings about Mr. Brocklehurst. Quote 8. Go into the library. If you please. Excuse my tone of command. I'm used to say, do this and it is done. I cannot alter my customary habits for one new inmate, Mr. Rochester. Mr. Rochester has just asked Jane if she plays the piano, and she had indicated that she knows how to play a little. He wants to hear her and therefore commands her into the library. But notice what he says to her, and keep in mind she is his employee, not his equal. Yet he talks to her as his equal. He asks her forgiveness that he ordered her to do something, and explained it was because he was so used to giving orders and people adhering to his request. He tells her that it would be too hard to change his customs for one person, although he does because he added the "if you please" after requesting her to go and play. What this indicates is that he is looking at her more than an employee, even though they have known each other a little over 24 hours. He is treating her as if she is not an employee but an equal. This shows he already has strong feelings for her. And not only does he show her an unnecessary amount of respect for an employee, but he is also showing a genuine interest in her, wanting to hear her play the piano and then following that up with wanting to see drawings he discovers she had sketched. This is an inordinate amount of attention he is showering on someone that works for him in such an insignificant capacity. That is why I argue that he has already had addictive energy activated at this time. Mr. Rochester goes on to scrutinize each of the sketches Jane showed him that she drew. He goes on to question her in fine detail about her work. when she drew them, where she was at, how she thought of the inspiration for them, etc. But it was the question in this next quote that I want to highlight. Were you happy when you painted these pictures? Asked Mr. Rochester presently. This question is a very deep question for someone one just met. He is wanting to know how she felt on such an intimate level when she was doing something she was passionate about. Think about yourself in this same situation. You just meet someone that you find out draws, writes, or maybe even sings, and you see or hear their work for the first time. How would you comment on their work? For many, it would be a simple statement of acknowledgement or maybe validation that their work was good. But think about the question, were you happy when you created this? That becomes a very personal and intimate question. Art is often created through emotions, and that question was a loaded question to get deep into the inner mind frame of that person. I'd argue that you'd only ask someone that you really wanted to get to know that personal of a question so quickly after meeting them. In this meeting, there is one final reference Mr. Rochester makes to Jane about being an elf. He tells her that her thoughts about her drawings are elfish. I wanted to know why he would reference her in this manner. In the Middle Ages, elves and fairies, especially the females, were regarded as beautiful and magical creatures. They were thought to have powers that could be used for good or evil. After the medieval period, the references to elves in British culture started to become more uncommon. But it wasn't until the Edwardian and Victorian period that there was this resurgence to the myth. And Bronte uses it in Jane Eyre to show the way that Mr. Rochester viewed Jane from early on as one that is magical. We will conclude part 2 here. Jane and Mr. Rochester soon depart after he looks at her sketches. I hope the exchanges discussed in this episode start to demonstrate why I can easily establish the twin flame attributes in the characters. We will continue to dig deeper into their connection and watch as more clues unfold. Thank you for joining me this episode of Soul Love Through Literature. I look forward to next week's Soul Time Story Time with you all.